Hello students, welcome to Module 4.3.7, Prezygotic RIMs. You'll recall last time we introduced you to the concept of speciation. We told you there are two main steps. First, you have to have some sort of isolation which will prevent gene flow from occurring, and then because of the stoppage or cessation of gene flow, the second step is that you will have genetic divergence, or genetically the two isolated populations will drift apart until this leads to the production of RIMs, reproductive isolating mechanisms. I told you last time there are two types of RIMs, prezygotic and postzygotic RIMs, and now we're going to explore what some of the prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms are. One example of a prezygotic RIM would be an ecological reproductive isolating mechanism. And this would be when species occur in the same region, but they occupy different habitats and rarely encounter one another. Consider, for example, one species of snake that lives in a tree and another in a burrow. Refer back to your little diagram you drew of the two steps of speciation, and if those differential mutations caused one of the species to live in a tree and the other one to live in a burrow, then if the two came together again, they would have reproductive isolation. They wouldn't be able to reproduce because they would never encounter one another. Another example of this is lions and tigers. And you might be going, wait a second, Mr. Charters. Lions occur in Africa and tigers in Asia, but this is in fact an Asiatic lion which occurs in the Gir forest of Bangladesh. And although the two could produce hybrids, they don't. But there are hybrids that can occur in captivity. And here is Hercules the liger. And notice I'll just read the caption here. It says, the lifespans of ligers and tigons, like most hybrids, are shorter than those of naturally occurring species. All known instances of tiger-lion interbreeding have been in captivity. The two species naturally overlap only near the Gir Preserve in Bangladesh, and even then the big cats would be unlikely to mingle. And so we only have hybrids that occur in nature. And it matters which one is the father and which one is the mother as to whether or not the hybrids are fertile. At least that's how I'm remembering it. I don't have a perfect knowledge or recollection of this. I did encounter a pretty cool site about big cat hybrids on the internet. But notice that this liger is exhibiting one of the traits of hybrid matings. It's exhibiting what is called hybrid vigor, where the hybrid offspring is more vigorous, and that is to say larger than either the mother or the father. This is a huge, huge cat, 900 pounds. Here, kitty, 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 kitty. All right, so that's ecological isolation, and it doesn't have to... It can be something fairly subtle. Let's look at a second prezygotic isolating mechanism, and that would be behavioral prezygotic isolating mechanisms, in which the factor which is changed would be the behavior of the two isolated populations, leading to reproductive isolating mechanisms that would prevent them from interbreeding if they came together again. And so this could take the form of unique behavioral sequences. Think of how birds do particular courtship dances, or even spiders do courtship dances, excuse me, in a particular way. It could be the pitch at which a fruit fly's wings are whining, and pheromones is also something else that could be changed. These are recognition chemicals that are sent out. These are especially important for reproduction in insects, but here might be an example of we could have a change in the courtship dance. These are blue-footed boobies, and they actually step back and forth, and it's like they're showing their blue feet. Look what great blue feet I have, and the other one will go, yes, look what great blue feet I have. And so if one of the changes that occurred was the color of the feet of such a seabird, then perhaps there would be no mating, and it could lead to isolation. Another example of behavioral isolation is pheromones. This is an incredible photograph here on the right, taken from a site, a website called Moss of Southeastern Arizona. A faculty member at the University of Arizona produces it. And these are huge moths, some of these. It's really incredible. They're all being attracted to lights on a sheet in the evening. This is by Pena Blanca, which is a lake over in Santa Cruz County, artificial body of water. Pretty cool. But just to show you about pheromones, I've shown you here a male and a female of the tricolor buck moth, and I want you to pay particular attention to the antenna. Notice the female has simple filamentous antenna, while the male has these plumose or feathery antenna. The male actually uses those antennae to detect and follow pheromones that the female releases. And so the male will typically fly to the female. And so just imagine what would happen if we had populations of moths that were isolated and changes occurred to the pheromone chemicals. So no longer would members of one population be attracted to the pheromones of the other population. This could serve as a prezygotic mating reproductive isolating mechanism. And this would be of the behavioral type. So take a look at this. There's a female moth, and see these little circles represent the pheromone chemicals that are wafting away from her. And of course, the males are greatly attracted to that. And so here come the males. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. And just suppose, as I said earlier, that if the pheromones of one population changed when isolated from the other populations, then that could result in a behavioral reproductive isolating mechanism. Another example of a behavioral RIM is different calls. Here are 3 species of green lacewings. This is what a green lacewing looks like. They're little things about a ½ inch long, and their eyes are very golden color. They're little predaceous insects. They feed on aphids and little small insects like that. And these lines represent sonograms. And so these are bursts of sound, and you can see that they have different frequencies and different amplitudes. And so they actually have different calls. And that also can be a reproductive isolating mechanism. Let's look at a third category of prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism, and this would be temporal or seasonal. Temporal referring to time within a 24-hour cycle, and seasonal referring to time on an annual cycle or a cycle of 1 year. And so different species are active or reproduce at different times, and this can be sufficient to serve as a behavioral reproductive isolating mechanism. It can be as simple as consider a hawk and an owl. They're both birds of prey. The hawk is active in the day, the owl is active at night. Therefore, they don't encounter one another. If those little changes and mutations that occur change the time of activity, it could change whether or not they could encounter one another. Another example would be 5 species of frogs, all in the same genus of Varana, which happens to be the Spanish word for frog, also the Latin word. They can occur together in the eastern United States, but they don't hybridize because they have different breeding times, or if their breeding times overlap a little bit, they have different behavioral RIMs that prevent such breeding. And here we can see. And these little, I don't know why, but my little wave files aren't working, so I'm not getting the sounds when I click on these things. So I'll try to fix that, but I wouldn't hold your breath for right now. But you can see that they do have different peak breeding times, but there is some overlap among them. Another example of a temporal isolating mechanism can be found in plants. For example, pine trees are pollinated by wind, and so the time at which pollen is released and the time at which the female cones are receptive to pollen has to coincide. If you have mutations that change this timing, you could have reproductive isolation. When I was at NAU, in my lab group, there was a guy who was looking at hybridization in pinyon pines, and he would go out and just see when the pine trees were releasing pollen. He was doing that. He was actually a long-term employee, so he wasn't just doing a graduate degree and leaving, but he'd been doing that for years, getting an idea of different populations of pine trees and when they release pollen. Let's look at another category of prezygotic rim, and this would be mechanical or physical rim. So this would be a reproductive isolating mechanism due to the form or the shape. And you can have structural differences that can prevent mating. You can have the size and the structure of copulatory organs changing. For example, here is a snake, and this is a male. Of course, this was a dead snake that was in a jar and is taken out and photographed. These are hemipenes. So these are intromittent organs, which is a fancy way of saying this is a penis, and it's used for copulation. Now, snakes and lizards both have two, and they're called hemipenes, and they only use one at a time, so don't think menage a trois. There's not a three-way going on here, but they do have these things. And the hemipenes, actually, of different species are shaped differently. This one just has simple little spikes on them, but some of them really have a unique shape. And an example of where hemipenes are believed to be important in terms of producing reproductive isolation is in the black-headed snakes, and these occur here in southern Arizona. And so we can see 4 different species that have some degree of overlap. They don't all perfectly overlap or whatever, but it has been reported in the literature that the hemipenes are shaped differently and that they may serve as a mechanical barrier to hybrid mating. In addition, there are some ecological factors that help to isolate the 4 species as well, with slight differences in habitat preference where they're less likely to encounter the different species. But nevertheless, it is interesting that the reproductive organs can be modified, kind of like a lock and key. I don't think it's nearly so absolute as that. And here is an example which illustrates that. Here is, it has been reported that bush babies, which are these little prosimians, they are very primitive primates, that they are mechanically isolated. Each species has distinct genitalia, like locks and keys, only for genitalia of its own species. Turns out that it's not so simple as that. I took this picture of the of penises of bush babies, and this is the article from which I took it, and it made the assertion that the differences in penis morphology was indicative of species-specific differences, but that they may be a form of sexual selection. That is, that the penis shape is one penis shape is more preferred than another by females, and so this could be a way that we could have sexual selection as well as mechanical isolation, or instead of mechanical isolation. So I wouldn't definitively claim that bush babies have mechanical isolation, but it has been supposed that that is a possibility in the past. But here's an alternative hypothesis. And of course, it's tough to work those kind of things out. I don't want you to think that it's not always about genitalia, but in this case, it's about floral structure. Now, flowers are sex organs, and so the pollination of this plant called Scotch broom by a bumblebee, the bumblebee is heavy enough that will actually open up the flower, and this is not possible if the insect is a smaller insect like a honeybee. It's not heavy enough to open the flower, and so this can be an isolating mechanism as well. So I just wanted to show you another possible mechanical isolation example. And with that, we're going to conclude the module on prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms.